When all Americans are treated as equal, no more who they are or whom they love, we are all more free. Words by former President Barack Obama. Every gay and lesbian person who has been lucky enough to survive the turmoil of growing up is a survivor. Survivors always have an obligation to those who will face the same challenges. Words by Bob Paris, writer, actor.
Good morning, everyone. 35 years ago today, Marty and I, who had met 11 days earlier, went into New York to see the Gay Pride Parade. And we were standing on the sidelines on 57th Street, and Marty said, "Let's march in the parade." And I said, "I don't think that's a good idea." I said, "I'm a teacher in New Jersey, and you never know who's going to be here." And he said, "It's New York. No one's going to see you. Why bother?" So I thought about it for a moment, and I said, "Okay." So we went under the barrier and started to walk. And we got about a half a block. And I hear, "Mr. Z, Mr. Z, Mr. Z." And 3 of my students come running over and they said, "We didn't know you were gay." And I said, "Well, now you do." So Marty said, "You're not going to tell that story today." And I said, "Oh, yes." I said, I tell that story all the time. I have another one that goes, if you ask a question during the panel part, I'll answer about how it got worse. Much worse. Today in New York City is the Gay Pride Parade. Throughout the United States during the month of June, in every major city and in many smaller ones, an LGBTQ parade occurs to commemorate the Stonewall riots of 1969. The first parade occurred on June 28, 1970. Marty and I, as you well know now, have marched in many of those parades. The advances of the civil rights movement for the LGBT community started long before 1969. This would not have happened if not for the heroic work of those who came before us, the abolitionists, the surrogates, the women's movement, to name just a few. As Sammy Baldwin stated, we stand here before you because of the work in the advancement of civil rights for all Americans done by many others before us. Today, we will give you a brief history of the LGBT community. We will point out some of the significant years and have some of our members talk about their lives. Betsy has been given the monumental task of covering gay history from the time of Oscar Wilde to 1954 in 3 minutes.
Hi, I'm Betsy, and I'm a professor of sociology and gender and sexuality studies and movements for social change, so this is really challenging for me to give you this extremely brief LGBTQ history of the entire West. According to scholars Michel Foucault and Jonathan Ned Katz, Western society invented the notions of heterosexuality and homosexuality only in the late 19th century. This shift was publicly marked in 1895 when Oscar Wilde, renowned poet and playwright, sued his lover's father for libel. His lover's father had called him a sodomite. He lost his case, then was countersued for sodomy and gross indecency, the first kind of well-known trial in which those charges were brought. He was found guilty, imprisoned for 2 years of hard labor. Upon his release, although he resumed writing, he died shortly thereafter, depressed, broke, and utterly broken in 1900 at the age of 46. In 1924, the term heterosexual first appeared publicly in a New York Times book review article in a comment about Sigmund Freud. So the notion that heterosexuality is a thing, let alone that heterosexuality is a normal thing, a normal identity, is not yet a century old. The conceptual dichotomy of hetero versus homosexual did not actually come into common use until the 1960s. However, in Nazi Germany, the pink triangle was used as one of the Nazi concentration camp badges to identify male prisoners who were sent there because of their presumed homosexuality. When the number of gay men in German concentration camps, while that number is hard to estimate, the number of men convicted for homosexuality from 1933 to 1944 is estimated at 50 to 63,000. After the camps were liberated at the end of the war, many of the pink triangle prisoners were simply re-incarcerated. During World War II, Alan Turing, the English computer scientist, mathematician, and philosopher, worked for the British government decoding German intelligence, enabling the Allied powers to defeat the Nazis in Europe and leading to the creation of the computer. In 1952, during his highly successful post-war laboratory career, Turing was prosecuted for homosexual acts under gross indecency legislation. He opted for chemical castration using DES as an alternative to prison with disastrous effects on his health and well-being. And in 1954, he died from poisoning, presumably from suicide, at 41 years old, younger than I am now. In April 1953, one of Dwight Eisenhower's first acts was to sign Executive Order 10450, prohibiting the federal government from employing sexual perverts in any military or civilian job. Now I'm going to go past 1954. In 1957, the Billy Tipton Trio released 2 successful jazz albums in the midst of Billy Tipton's multi-decade, very successful jazz career until he retired from music in the 70s. Upon his death at 74 in 1989, one of Tipton's adult sons learned as he watched paramedics trying to save his father's life that his father was in fact a transgender man who had been living as a woman only personally in his personal life earlier in his career while passing as a man professionally in order to have a jazz career. But later on, he lived entirely as a man, so his children and a couple of his partners didn't know that he'd ever lived as a woman. As Tony mentioned, in 1969, the Stonewall Bar in New York was the site of one of the police department's regular violent raids on gay bars. And on that occasion, the drag queens and gay patrons of the Stonewall fight back, igniting what is now known as the gay rights or LGBTQ movement. In more recent decades, just super briefly, in 1987, hundreds of LGBTQ activists in New York formed ACT UP to demand greater access to experimental AIDS drugs and a coordinated policy to fight HIV and AIDS. ACT UP adopted the pink triangle and the slogan "Silence equals death" as its logo. In 1990, Queer Nation, an LGBTQ activist organization, was founded by HIV/AIDS activists from ACT UP, and they were the first to deploy the slogan, "We're here, we're queer, get used to it." Simultaneously, 2 founding texts of the field of queer studies were published, Gender Trouble by Judith Butler and Epistemology of the Closet by Eve Sedgwick, raising very real scientific questions about our binary categories of sex and gender and sexuality. In 1994, in my early 20s, I attended the 25th anniversary of the Stonewall riot, commemorated by the Lesbian Avengers, in a huge Dyke March in New York City, where thousands of women, led by the Dykes on Bikes, meaning lesbians on motorcycles, rode and marched down the streets, out and proud and loud, and giving this very young, very queer person the chills. I'm getting it again. And then finally, most recently, in 2002, Germany issued an official policy to the gay community for their treatment by the Nazis. In 2017, Britain retroactively pardoned Alan Turing, Oscar Wilde, and 50,000 additional men for convictions under legislation outlawing homosexual acts. Scotland and Canada issued very similar apologies. Recently, Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, delivered historic apology and millions of dollars in financial restitution to LGBT Canadians in the House of Commons for decades of, quote, state-sponsored systematic oppression and rejection that had been encouraged by U.S. intelligence agencies. Speaking to a packed and emotional chamber, Trudeau expressed shame, sorrow, and deep regret to the civil servants, military members, and criminalized Canadians who endured discrimination and injustice based on their sexual orientation. The United States has yet to issue any such statement or restitution. And most recently, in 2017 and 18, the current occupant of the White House rescinded existing civil rights protections for LGBTQ youth, students, and workers in the United States.
Thank you, Betsy. Sheila? Sheila is going to talk about the years 1954 to the present for the life of a transsexual person.
Hi, y'all. I have some prepared remarks, and I'm going to have to read them really fast because we don't only have 3 minutes. But I realized that a lot of you may not really understand trans men, trans women, and so forth. And our sexuality is completely different from our, shall we say, appearance. And most of us have known since we were tiny and got yelled at that we thought we were the opposite gender. So for the most of us, we're born that way. Some are intersex. That means they have organs of both male and female. Sometimes it's obvious, and sometimes it is not. There's a famous one, guy that got shot up or whatever happened to him in Afghanistan, and the medics, after the MRI, said, do you know, dude, you got ovaries? And so these things have led to a lot of confusion, both among the trans community and the general community. So anyway, here goes. When I was a child in the 50s, there was, to the best of my knowledge, only one place where you could go, drink, and meet if you were gay. The police used to raid it and beat patrons up, mostly for fun. And then it was raided again and again and again with the intent to close it for causes such as having a poster about a gay rooster laying an egg and convoluted solicitation as in, let's have fun. In San Francisco, the Cooper Donuts riot in May 1959 was caused by police coming into the cafe and demanding IDs. At that time, if the ID didn't match how you were dressed, you were taken to jail. The police arrested a number of patrons, including 2 drag queens. When they tried to shove everyone into the police car with not enough room, others started throwing coffee and trash at the police, who drove off without the ones they arrested. In the 60s, San Francisco was the scene of another trans riot. One of them occurred at the chain cafeteria called Compton's that was always open. It was one of the few places trans folk could hang out without being harassed. But then the staff started calling the police, thinking that, well, trans customers might be keeping the more desirable customers away. At one point, one of the trans women threw coffee in the face of the police, and the riot began with the gay community joining in. The following night, the windows were smashed out again and a picket was started, but it failed, and transgender people were no longer allowed in. But that started a movement. Then on midnight in 1967, undercover police entered the Black Cat Tavern in LA and started arresting people for kissing at midnight on New Year's Eve. They started beating people, some horribly so, which started a riot that spread across the street to another establishment where they knocked down the woman owner and beat 2 bartenders unconscious. This was 2.5 years before the Stonewall riots, but didn't generate much publicity. But it led to the founding of The Advocate. That's basically a gay publication. I'm not sure it's still in existence. And with the Patch riot, the MCC Church, which is a basically a gay church. They're a Christian church. They've gone through some changes over the years. Then came the famous Stonewall Inn riots. It started on June 28, 1969. The Stonewall was a decrepit, mafia-owned bar that, to be honest, preyed a bit on the gay community, but for the most part, paid to keep the police in line, and the only place around to go and dance. Then came the unexpected police raid. Well, the fairies, they weren't supposed to fight back, which upset both the police and some of the members of the gay community who wanted to be preserved as, oh, well, just normal people. Well, they are. What happened that night was the usual brutality, but for whatever reason, the patrons didn't cooperate with standard procedures, and 2 or so days of riots took place, there and elsewhere. The police would feel up the woman, to prove they weren't men. This time, the press was involved, and the story was spread far and wide, and several books have been written about the riots.
Thank you, Sheila. The years 1973 to 2003 took the LGBT community from being mentally ill and criminals to being psychologically healthy and non-criminals. How this happened will be told. In 1973, the American Psychological Association declared homosexuality per se was not a psychiatric disorder. Marty will talk about being gay at the age of 18 in 1973.
Good morning. The year was 1973. I was 18 years old, living in Connecticut. I could drive, drink, and vote because 18 was the legal age at the time. The night after I graduated high school, I got up enough courage to stand outside one of Hartford, Connecticut's 3 gay bars. I remember being terrified. I didn't have the nerve at the time to actually open the door and go in. I had no idea what inside would be like. Would I be laughed at? Would I be molested? A million things ran through my mind. I stood outside hoping someone would come up to me and start talking. I wasn't standing there long before a man in a shiny new car pulled up and said, "Get in." I did. As we drove away, I didn't even ask where we were going. I was too busy staring at him. He was a handsome guy, but old. It turns out he was 28 years old, married with 2 young kids. I asked him where his wife thought he was right now, and he said he had told her that he needed to go back to work for an hour or so and check up on some guests that were staying at a boutique hotel that he managed. He asked me if I wanted to go back with him to his hotel, and I said yes. He asked me what I was doing standing outside a gay bar, and I told him that I thought I might be gay. I told him that I didn't have the courage to go inside. I asked him what it was like inside the bar. He said it was loud music, guys drinking beer, and having a good time. He said it was like any other bar, only the men in there liked other men. He said there was nothing to be afraid of. Then he asked me how old I was, and I said 18. I told him that I had just graduated high school the night before. I remember him getting nervous, and I thought he was mad at me. I thought he might throw me out of the car at the next corner. He asked if I had ever done anything with a guy before. I said that I had not had any sexual experiences. He told me that just a few years earlier, you could not walk into a gay bar without knowing somebody. They didn't have signs, and you really didn't know a bar was there. He said you also had to worry about the bar being raided by the cops. He said the Stonewall riots changed all of that. Cops didn't raid the bars anymore, and their existence was more open. We got to his hotel, which turned out to be very nice. We talked for a while. I remember shaking the whole time I was talking with him. He told me that I didn't have to do anything if I didn't want to. I said I wanted to. I remember thinking afterwards what a nice guy he was. He talked to me for at least an hour before he drove me home. He didn't drive me all the way home because it turned out that he lived in my section of the city and was nervous that somebody would see him. I walked the last mile home and remember thinking, number one, I was still alive. Number two, I enjoyed my first sexual experience with another man. And number three, now I had to keep a secret that nobody could find out about. I never saw that man again. Hartford is not a big city, and I always thought that I would run into him at some point. I wanted to thank him for being kind and understanding. It wasn't meant to be. I did go back to that bar, and this time I opened that front door and went inside. I found out that it was just like the man explained it. Loud music, guys drinking beer, and everyone having a good time.
Thank you, Marty. In 1986, the United States Supreme Court, in the case of Bowers versus Hartwick, dealt the LGBT community a blow by affirming states' rights, the right of the state to enforce sodomy laws targeting homosexuals. Sue will talk about the years right around 1986. Sue?
Happy Gay Day, everybody. I was born and raised in the streets of Jersey City, the best tom girl you ever saw, to the disdain of my mother, who gave me the back of her hand on most occasions. She once explained that she wanted to toughen me up. She did. I guess you could say I went to the school of hard knocks. Having worked for 6 years to get enough money to put myself through college, I joined the state police, Marine Law Enforcement Division, and was stationed periodically in Point Pleasant, Monmouth Beach, Lake Hopatcong, New Jersey for 6 years. I had my own 16-foot Boston whaler and in various bodies of water, and I was discriminated against for being female. The only one of four at that time in the state of New Jersey. No one knew I was gay. I love the water. Having joined the United States Coast Guard Reserves, I became Petty Officer Parks, Port Security Division, Captain of the Ports, Governor's Island, New York Harbor, for 10 years. No one knew I was gay. We boarded vessels from foreign countries, responded to massive oil spills from barges, inspected facilities, and did various inspections for the public safety. I became domesticated 34 years ago when I met Julie and was married by Reverend Marsh at our UU church here in January 2017. Thanks for giving us such a good party. Only you, Julie, and the IRS know I'm gay. Your acceptance of us as we are is greatly appreciated, for we are the others. Thank you.
In 2003, the United States Supreme Court, in Lawrence versus the state of Texas, declared sodomy laws unconstitutional, overturning and reversing Bowers versus Hartwick. This reversal could have far-reaching consequences for the future of the LGBT community, particularly under President Trump. I will talk about 2003 and a little bit time before that. Marty and I celebrated our 20th anniversary in 2003. We had long been activists, and we had lived through the AIDS epidemics of the 80s and 90s. We would read the obituaries on a Sunday morning and make comments like, "He was 43, he lived a long life," or "He was 19, he hardly lived his life at all. I lost former students, a married colleague, and Marty and I lost many friends. Thank the Lord. I know I'm not supposed to use that word here. Thank the Lord for the lesbian community who helped the gay community handle all of the AIDS epidemics of the 80s and 90s. September 11th, 2001, we all remember that day. Marty called me from his office overlooking the towers after the first plane hit. His phone went dead when the second plane hit. I worked in a school where many parents worked at the Trade Center. We lost several parents that day. I did my job as a counselor, not knowing what had happened to Marty. That night, I cried when the president of his company would not tell me any information about Marty because I was not his next of kin. Marriage equality, I now knew what that meant firsthand. And as you all know, Marty is here today, and we celebrated our 35th anniversary on June 13th. And we were married 5 years ago in November. The struggle for equal rights continues every day for all of us. In 2013, the Defense of Marriage Act, the Marriage Act in California, were major victories for the LGBT community. And in October of 2013, New Jersey legalized same-sex marriage. As I heard this on the news, I texted my grandson and said, "Will you be the best man at our wedding?" And he texted back, "Grandpa, I'd love to." In 2015, the United States Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage in all 50 states. Julie will talk about her life up until 2017.
Hello. I knew I was attracted to women when I was 6 or 7. That was around 1968 or 69. I gave my gym teacher a ring. I told her I loved her. She told the principal called my mother into school. And my mother thought I was sleeping on the sofa, and I just heard her say casually to my sister, "Do you think Julie has a problem?" Claudia said nothing, and that was the only thing that I ever heard about homosexuality or gayness at all growing up. It was over 12 years later before I was finally able to come out to myself. After church one Sunday, I was reading the Sunday paper. That was when we had real news, not fake news. And I was looking at the circulars of the men and the women together and sitting in the lawn chairs, and everybody was obviously having a wonderful life. And I realized I wanted to be married and live in a house with a cat and a white picket fence and a woman. Oops. At that time, gay marriage was unheard of. That was in around 1980, 81. And eventually, gay people had commitment ceremonies. Then civil unions were recognized by some states. Civil unions had few of the 1,400 benefits of legal marriage, but had a lot of disadvantages. Finally, in 2015, the Supreme Court legalized full marriage equality for same-sex couples. After 31 years together and a lifetime of dreaming of having a marriage like my parents' happy marriage of over 50 years, my dreams could finally come true. And our UUCSJ congregation, with Maxine as our wedding planner, gave us one heck of a party. and helped us celebrate in style on January 15th of 2017.
This morning, we have tried to relate to you how we have moved forward in the LGBTQ community to achieve what our founding fathers declared for themselves back in 1776.